anything about where the alleged shooter was, whether there were victims? What did you know when you approached the building?
At that point, I had a conversation with someone in our intelligence group that had confirmed related information that they'd received, that there were fatalities, there were injured victims.
Did you know whether or not the shooter was in custody?
No, I didn't. I assumed that I didn't hear any gunfire when I got to the school, so I assumed that either the shooter was in custody or it was a barricade. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew that it was not an active shooting scene.
Did you do anything before you entered the building? Were you carrying a weapon? Were you?
Yeah, so I put on my vest and then ran to the front of the school with other people from the parking lot that were approaching the school. As I got closer, the person at the door verified my identity as a law enforcement officer, and then at that time was informed that the shooter was in custody and that they were starting kind of to figure out who was going to be responsible for what inside of the school. As you can imagine, it was a very chaotic scene. And
okay. You mentioned a vestibule when you earlier. What do you mean? It
was like the front area in front of like the front of the school where you'd have like offices where you check in if you were taking your kid out sick for the day. It was the main office area, and that's where I was directed to meet with Lieutenant Willis, who was identified as being the officer in charge of the scene.
Is there a difference between the phase of clearing a crime scene versus evidence collection?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury what the difference is and what comes first and what that is like?
Sure. So, at least the way ATF is trained, it would be an active shooter response. It would be a train and to find and eliminate the threat. After that has occurred, you have a clearing of the school, tactical clearing of the school to ensure there's no other bodies, secondary devices, or things of that nature. In this instance, it became clear that there were two things going on at once. There was people volunteering to clear the school for a second time, and then there was Lieutenant Willis, who was directing more of the investigative aspects of this case.
When you arrived, do you know about what time you arrived?
I don't recall exactly what time I arrived. No.
Okay. Were there still students in the school?
Not. If there were, if they were in classroom, I wasn't aware of it. I did not see any students when I got to the school.
Was part of your role to engage in clearing the school?
So generally, yes, with ATF, we would be involved in clearing the school, the active shooter response, the clearing of the school, and then the investigation.
I mean, when you got there that day, did you help clear the school?
I did not. Based on the fact that the investigation had started, that the shooter was in custody and they had the weapon secured, I thought the best use of my abilities as an ATF agent would be to start the trace of the firearm to determine how it ended up there.
Okay. You just said you found Lieutenant Willis. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Where was he standing?
He was standing in front of the school offices. At one point, he was standing on a chair directing people around. Like I said, it was a very, very chaotic. But I found Lieutenant Willis, and I believe someone had told him I would be coming to help trace the firearm, and that's when I went over and located it.
And before that, had you ever met Lieutenant Willis?
No.
Okay. And what happened next?
So Lieutenant Willis held up a trash bin that had the murder weapon, several magazines, ammunition, and the shooter's cell phone inside, and I was able to take photographs of it.
Okay. A trash bin, a plastic trash bin?
Yes, so a trash, not a one you throw like a school lunch in, but like a small one you have in like an office, like a square or rectangle trash bin.
And if you know, what was it doing there, or how did it get there?
It was my understanding that evidence was placed in there to keep it safe while they were continuing to clear the school.
Okay. And you said he held it up, and then what happened?
I took photographs of the evidence, specifically the markings on the firearm that I needed to start the tracing process.
And when you say markings, what do you mean by markings?
So the firearms are required to have a make, model, and a serial number. Those three items are necessary to start the trace for ATF to determine where it was first sold.
Did you actually physically pick up the weapon?
I don't believe so. I don't think we wanted to preserve the evidence. I believe that the firearm was already flipped in a way that had the markings visible. I believe I just took a photograph of it and then provided that information to the intelligence group that would initiate the actual digital part of the trace.
Okay. Once you did that, what did you do next?
So once that process had been started, I went to Lieutenant Sam Marsban, who I had known from the Oakland County Sheriff's Office based on prior investigations in Pontiac, and asked what could be done, what needed to be done. And at that time, I began collecting facts for the timeline for a search warrant affidavit for the Crumbley's family residence.
Okay. Did you? Well, we'll get to that. As part of your investigation, did you ever look at the surveillance video of the shooting?
Yes.
Okay. Before we get to that, did you? What are the steps, and how long does it take to trace a firearm through the ATF?
So the timing of every trace is going to be different based on the records and how fast they're able to get to ATF. So it'll help you to understand the tracing process starts with those three things, right? The make, model, and serial number of the firearm. Once you have that information and you input it, you can trace it back to the first manufacturer, right? And when the manufacturer is then contacted by ATF, they can tell you which federally licensed gun store they sold it to, and then that gun store has to tell you who was the first person that purchased that firearm.
And did you learn who that was?
Yes, it was an individual in Rochester, Michigan, who had obtained the firearm from the gun store in Oxford.
And then, was that person contacted?
Yes.
And were they contacted by you or someone on your team?
It was two ATF agents assigned to the same division I'm assigned to.
And what did they learn?
They learned that that individual had sold the firearm back to the Oxford gun store sometime in early September.
And then what did they do?
They went to the gun store and spoke to Ms. Cammie Back, who testified previously, and learned that the firearm was in fact, purchased by Mr. Crumbley on November 26, 2021.
So 4 days earlier?
Yes.
Okay. And if we can stop for a moment, did you just say September?
I meant November. I'm
okay,
sorry.
thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you to Mr. Case who pointed that out. November, correct?
November,
okay.
Yes. And, yeah.
If we want to stop here for a moment, walk us through a general purchase of a firearm through a federally firearm licensee.
Sure. So if you walk into a gun store today to buy a firearm, you'd have to fill out what Ms. Back testified was called an ATF Form 4473. It would have information about yourself as well as information about the firearm you're purchasing. The FFL employee then would contact the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, the NICS system, through the FBI. And once they're given the okay to sell you the firearm, they proceed with that.
Do you know if that protocol and procedure was followed here?
Yes,
in this
it was.
case? All right. You just stated that in order to buy a firearm, you have to go through all those steps. Is that all guns? Do you have to go through this process?
So for every firearms sale from a federal firearms licensee, you do have to fill out the ATF 4473 and have those steps be fulfilled, yes.
Does that include all guns, long guns and pistols?
Yes.
Okay. And are there differences in long guns versus pistols?
Yes.
In terms of who can buy them and where?
Yes, in terms of age and things like that, there are different restrictions on the types of firearms you're purchasing.
Okay, and in general, how would you describe the restrictions on what is more restricted and less restricted?
Sure. So under federal law, if you're going to buy a firearm from a federal firearms licensee, you have to be 21 years of age to buy a handgun and 18 to buy a long gun. That would be either a rifle or a shotgun.
All right. And what about registering a weapon?
So there's no federal requirement for registration of a weapon. There is, however, obviously based on my experience in this case and others through the task force work, I'm aware obviously in Michigan that there are certain registration requirements for handguns. And
why, but the same requirements for long guns?
No.
And do you know why that is?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
Only if you know. Did you
I
say
have to ask him first if he knows that's what I'm trying to do.
Did you say in the state there is a federally, but there's a state?
Correct.
Okay. State of Michigan.
Through your position in the ATF, do you know why?
Can you answer my question?
Yes,
Which
I thought he
State of
did.
Michigan?
It is the state of Michigan, yes.
Thank you.
Do you know why there are more restrictions on handguns?
I believe it's due to concealability.